Well, Ian Murray, there was a chance for Labour to vote for another referendum, which you've been campaigning for ages, last week, and they abstained.
Well, the People's Vote campaign and everyone associated with that made it quite clear that it was the wrong time to bring that amendment. I still voted for it, but the time to bring the amendment is when the Meaningful Vote 3 comes next week, because we've been working very hard on what's become known as the Kyle-Wilson Compromise, and that compromise is predicated on it being attached to the deal, which happens next week with the next Meaningful Vote.
Just hang on, let's have a jargon explanation there. Kyle-Wilson, this is a motion which says that Labour, among others, would vote for Theresa May's deal, or at least abstain so that it got through Parliament, but only on condition that her deal and remaining were put to the voters in the form of a referendum, right?
That's absolutely correct, and that's why it has to be attached to the next time that the Prime Minister brings her deal back to Parliament. So it was the wrong time last week to bring that. Last week was about making sure we got the extension to Article 50, because that motion that was passed on Thursday to allow the extension to Article 50 is conditional upon the Prime Minister bringing her deal back next week. And when she brings it back next week, this compromise agreement that you've just described would attach it to the deal. The deal would be allowed to pass only on the condition it goes to an affirmation referendum to the public.
Right. And are you convinced that Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour leadership will throw their weight behind that Kyle-Wilson amendment and whip it?
Well, the leadership of the Labour Party have said that this is party policy. Keir Starmer said 4 times in the chamber last week that we would be looking at the Kyle-Wilson amendment and supporting it. It will be whipped because it's Labour Party policy. Shadow ministers were dismissed from their posts last week for voting against the amendment on the People's Vote that happened on Thursday. So the Labour front bench are now supporting this. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn said on the Sophie Ridge programme on Sky this morning that they would support the Kyle-Wilson amendment if the Prime Minister's deal was to pass. And of course, it's predicated on making sure that the deal does pass the House of Commons, because that's the compromise.
It is said that one reason Labour is swinging behind this is because there are quite a few MPs have been threatening to either just to leave the party whip or to go over to the independent group. Are you one of those who've been making these threats?
Well, Gordon, the bottom line here is this is Labour Party policy, don't forget. This was unanimously agreed at Labour Party conference that when all the other options had been exhausted, and they've certainly been exhausted with bells on, we would move to a public vote with the option to remain. And the Kyle-Wilson amendment, as you've described it, was the compromise way of trying to get the maximum number of Labour members of Parliament together with the maximum number of Conservative backbenchers together to get this through Parliament. What are you saying? You have not been threatening to resign? Well, if nobody's been threatening to resign on this basis, because we've been working to try and make sure that Labour Party policy is delivered. Next Monday or Tuesday, when the Prime Minister brings the deal back, will be the time when this amendment is put forward, and I would fully expect for the Labour front bench to back this, to whip it, and we've got a real chance of winning it. And that would mean that the Prime Minister's deal would go back to the public with the option to remain, and as soon as the final result is announced, that would become law. It was used a process in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement. It's a good process. It's a good compromise. Many of your colleagues who have similar views to you, who don't see themselves as Corbynites, are very worried, aren't they, about being deselected before the next election. That seems to have been one of the motivations of some of the people who've broken away to join the independent group. I was quite intrigued listening to Nick Bowles earlier, who is now effectively a member of the National Conservative Party, but has resigned from his local branch association. And the whips seem quite happy for him to stay as a Tory MP. Are there, I mean, I'm sure you're not personally in this situation, but is there any mechanism in the Labour Party for some of your colleagues down south who have these fears that they will be deselected to do something similar? I don't know if there's any mechanism in the Labour Party to do so, because in order for you to leave your local Labour Party, you would have to leave the local Labour Party, and that means you would leave the party as a whole. So I'm not sure there's a mechanism to do that. I don't know how the Conservative Party works. But there is certainly deselection threats all over the country at the moment with local Labour parties and their members of Parliament. And the easiest way to deal with this is for the Labour leadership to say that if any Labour MP who's currently in a seat wishes to stand at the next election, they should be able to do so under the previous trigger ballot parts. My local member of the Scottish Parliament, Daniel Johnson, who's doing a fabulous job in Edinburgh Southern, was re-selected just a couple of weeks ago on the old rules with 92% of the vote. As long as the old rules stay in place, the leadership can keep them in place, then we will get over this deselection issue. It takes it off the table and would certainly take something out of Jeremy Corbyn's budgeting industry in terms of problems.
Just explain that, because what do you mean? You mean that existing Labour MPs should automatically be allowed to stand again?
Well, there's never been an automatic reselection. There's always been a trigger ballot whereby 50% of your membership, if they were to back you, then you were automatically reselected. If more than 50% decided they didn't want you to be their Member of Parliament, then you were deselected or going to a full selection process. That's been reduced to a third, which essentially means that one of the big trade unions could trigger Members of Parliament. So the best way to get around all of this stuff is just to say that we remain on the rules that we've already had.
The 50% rule.
The 50% rule, which is a perfectly fair rule. If more than 50% of your constituency Labour Party don't want you as a Member of Parliament, then a full selection takes place. That seems to be fair. That would take it off the table, and that would mean that all these deselection threats would be removed.
If you get what you want, which is another referendum, given the way this has developed, Labour say, or I think they say, they'd campaign for Remain in a referendum. The Labour Party is going to be in a very odd position. I mean, there will be people in, I think a majority of Labour constituencies voted to leave. It was in Labour's last manifesto that there would be Brexit. And Labour is going to have to go to these people and say, up until 5 minutes ago, we were arguing for Labour's version of Brexit, and now we're asking you to reject Theresa May's deal and stay in the European Union. And people in Leave constituencies are going to say, get lost, we'll just vote for Theresa May. Why on earth should we take you seriously?
Well, I think the key thing about having another referendum, if we were to get there, would be we'd be saying to the public, look, you gave the government a very clear instruction that you wanted to get out of the European Union. The government have taken that instruction and negotiated the deal that's on the table. We're now putting that deal back to you to see whether or not that's what you wish to have when you leave the European Union. And if it's not what you wish to have, then you'd be arguing to stay in the European Union. And that's what the Labour Party would certainly be arguing. And all the Leave seats where Members of Parliament, like in Redcar with Anna Turley or Phil Wilson and Sedgefield, who's put this compromise amendment together, they've taken that debate to their own constituencies, and they've got incredibly positive feedback on creating some leadership and creating the arguments around why we should stay. There is no deal that's as good as the one that we currently have, so let's get the deal that's been proposed on the table by acknowledging that people voted to leave and that's a deal that's been negotiated, and asking the public if that's what they want. We've had a general election since 2017, and by the end of next week we'll have voted on the Prime Minister's deal 3 times. So if we can vote 3 times on the same Prime Minister's deal, why don't we get this back to the people and see if this is what they really want? That seems a democratic thing to do, and the Labour Party should be arguing for that very vociferously.